Is 32GB of RAM still the sweet spot for PC gaming, or should you look more towards a higher capacity kit? Well, in order to answer that, we've tested them against each other just to see how much performance you could possibly be leaving on the table. And in order to find out, Patriot sent out a memory kit in each capacity, and they've both got the exact same speeds of 6000 megatransfers per second with a cache latency of CL36, so it's as apples to apples as it's going to get. As for testing, we've tested at full HD in every single game today with ray tracing results using upscaling. Speaking of which, the system we've used for testing is the Ryzen 9 7900X system, as it's the most powerful spare processor I had lying around that was compatible with these memory kits. And also our GPU of choice is the RTX 3080 10GB Founders Edition, and the rest of the specs for this system will be found in the description below with my Amazon affiliate links. I do make a small kickback from these, but it's at no extra cost to you. Anyhow, we've configured the 7900X with Precision Boost Overdrive, where it's running a negative offset of 25, and we've also done some tweaking to the 3080 where it's got some extra speed in the memory by plus 1000 MHz, and all testing has been done on driver version 576.80. Might have remembered it for once. Anyways, let's get straight into the benchmarks. The first game up today is Cyberpunk 2077, and set to the Ultra preset, there is basically no difference between both of these memory kits. The average in fact goes down by 1 frame per second with the 64GB kit. However, the frame times are slightly improved as we see an increase of 4 frames per second with the 1% low. So could you tell the difference between both these memory kits if the graphs were off? Probably not, so 32 gigs is totally fine in Cyberpunk 2077. God of War Ragnarok on the Ultra preset sees very similar behaviour, but we're seeing extra performance with the 64GB kit, albeit not too much, because we see an extra 2 frames per second for the average frame rate. That's not really a lot, and you won't notice it, especially when you're getting around 130 FPS to begin with. But the frame times are slightly improved by 4 frames per second, so I guess that counts by something. Certainly the outlier so far is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Yes, the average frame rate doesn't really budge all too much by, well, 1 frame per second with the 64GB kit, but we see a huge increase to the 1% lows as it goes up by 11 FPS, which can possibly be pretty noticeable. Is it worth spending the extra money on 64GB of RAM just for this improvement? I'm not too sure. I personally wouldn't do it if I wasn't video editing and stuff like that, so that's got to be known. And next we have The Witcher 3, and this game can be very CPU intensive, especially in the Novigrad area and on the DirectX 12 API, and that is kind of reflected in our result, as we see a 5 frame per second increase to our average frame rate, which to be honest isn't really that much, but the 1% lows do go up by around 7 frames per second, which isn't exactly significant, but it's still a measurable increase, so the frame time is looking better with 64 gigs of RAM. So with the AAA games at a lower resolution like 1080p, which is very low on a graphics card, even like the 3080, we don't really see too much of a performance increase going to the higher capacity memory. Now, some games do see a bit of an increase with the 1% lows like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and The Witcher 3, and this probably improved gameplay quite a bit. To be honest, I couldn't really tell too much of a difference between them, but I did kind of test them hours apart, so there is that. But if you're playing AAA games, especially when you go up to high resolutions like 1440p or even 4K, especially with a graphics card like this, you're probably not going to be noticing a difference here, because when you're more GPU bound, yeah, the CPU and memory matters a bit less there, if that makes sense. But where you will be CPU bound is competitive titles like Fortnite, and to be honest, we're getting bucket loads of performance across both memory configurations today, especially on DirectX 11 with the low preset and high textures. 64 gigs of RAM netted us a 1% increase to our average frame rate, which is definitely not a lot. It's within margin of error, let me put it that way, and the 1% lows only go up by 9 FPS. Yeah, it's just not worth upgrading to 64 gigs of RAM in a game like Fortnite because the performance increases just aren't there. And it's pretty much the same story in CS2. The average frame rate goes up by 1% yet again, which is definitely not a lot, and the 1% lows are also looking slightly better on it, And in fact, the 1% lower performance in this game, I thought it was an Intel related problem. It's happening on AMD as well, so I really don't know what's going on here. Maybe it's just a poorly optimized game. Compared to CSGO, it definitely is. Anyways, if you go up to 64 gigs of RAM, yeah, you won't really notice too much of a difference. And so far it's 3 out of 3 with Rainbow Six Siege, as yeah, the average frame rate barely budges. In fact, it went up by, you guessed it, 1% with the average frame rate. And the 1% lows, they barely budge as well, going up by 7 frames per second. So yeah, the dual rank of the 64 gigs of RAM didn't really do too much of a increase to performance here, and in fact it's definitely a lot less than what I was expecting. So yeah, the dual rank nature of 64GB DDR5 memory kits really isn't putting in that much work in improving competitive frame rates in competitive games. I've said competitive a bit. Anyways, the performance increases just aren't there, and I suspect you'll be much better off going with a higher speed or lower cache latency memory kit. Something like 64 Megatransfer CL32 would do you quite fine for a competitive gaming rig, and in fact, it'd probably do you quite well for any AM5 based gaming PC. And lastly, I want to throw in some ray tracing results, as RT hits your CPU harder than what you'd think. It definitely hits your GPU hard, but the CPU's got to do quite a bit of work as well. And yeah, the first game is Cyberpunk 2077 on the RT Ultra preset with DLSS set to quality, and the average frame rate does not budge at all. It's 97 and 97, so yeah, 64 gigs of RAM is definitely not an option in this game because you're just wasting money if you're purely gaming here. And 1% lows as well, they go up by 2 FPS with 64 gigs, so absolutely zero point in upgrading to one of these just for gaming in Cyberpunk. And then we have The Witcher 3. The average frame rate, yes, it doesn't really budge that much by like 1 frame per second, which is definitely not noticeable. But what could slightly be noticeable is the frame times. The 1% low goes up by 7 FPS, which going from 52 to 59 is actually kind of a big jump. It's more than 10%, so yeah, there is that. That's quite a big upgrade there. So yeah, 64 gigs of RAM does actually kind of make a difference in The Witcher 3. Not by much because the average frame rate doesn't go up, but the frame time is certainly smoother, so there is that. But upgrading to 64 gigs just for that is probably not worth it. So just like the competitive and regular rasterization results, there isn't a big change in performance with 64GB of RAM. To be fair, capacity wise, this was probably something I was expecting, but with the dual bank setup or configuration of these chips, I was expecting slightly more performance, but to be fair, we did kind of get some more in The Witcher 3, so that's got to count for something, I suppose. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that 32GB of memory in your gaming PC is certainly the sweet spot, even in 2025. The performance is there, it's not lacking behind 64GB in any significant capacity. Anyways, the value proposition is certainly there. It's definitely the best value memory capacity out there for gaming these days. So what I'll do is, if you're just purely gaming on your PC and doing no productivity at all, 32 gig is definitely the way to go, if you ask me. And even then, the performance uplift from 64 gigs of VRAM, definitely not VRAM, of memory isn't even down to the capacity. It's down to the fact that it's dual rank, and this means there are memory chips on either side of the module, and this can theoretically improve memory performance. And this is probably leading to the admittedly very minor performance increases, which we saw with this memory kit. However, if you're also a video or photo editor, this is where the higher capacity would certainly come into play. I tried editing on 32 gigs of RAM not too long ago, and yeah, it was not a fun experience. It was very stuttery and not very responsive at all. But rest assured, if you like to play games on your workstation, 64 gigs of RAM might even give you a bit of a performance uplift as well, let alone in your productivity application. So that's always good to know. But if you're just gaming and then maybe doing web browsing and that sort of stuff, 32GB of RAM is certainly what you should be looking for. Yes, you will save quite a bit of money going with half of the memory capacity, but you won't be losing half of the performance, that's for sure. And this is extra money It is. And this is extra money which you could be spending on more storage, another upgrade elsewhere in your PC, or you could just pocket the cash and invest it in some games. But if you want to see how leaving XMP disabled affects gaming performance, you can watch that out in a video up here. We made it not too long ago, so that might be right up your alley. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.